Hey guys, today we're going to start moving into the Constitutional Convention. When we left off yesterday, we realized that the Articles of Confederation were not working and that there was a dedicated group of American leaders that felt that there needed to be some change. It will be those men that bring us our second and current form of government, the U.S. Constitution. When some of these early leaders decide it's time to come together and write a new government, they decide to meet in Annapolis, Maryland. The problem with the initial meeting is that only 5 states show up. If you're going to try to change the government, you need everyone involved, and 5 states out of 13 is not enough. So they decide to postpone the meeting and meet again in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. This time we're going to end up with representatives from 12 of the 13 states, which is pretty good. They quickly realize that there is no way to fix the Articles of Confederation and that they really need to scrap it and come up with another document as our main set of rules for our government. As the men convene in Philadelphia, they start to ask themselves some really large questions about what their new government should look like. For instance, every state needs to send representatives to the Legislative Assembly. Well, how do you determine representation? We're going to talk about the Virginia plan versus the New Jersey plan. One is what we consider the large state plan, and one's a small state. Do you determine representation based on population, which is a state like what Virginia would want, or do you determine representation based on equal number? So our smaller states like Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, they would want it all to be the same, that every state sends, for instance, like one delegate, where the larger populated states aren't going to like that plan. So how do you come up with an answer? What about slavery? Do you abolish slavery? Do you abolish the slave trade? Do you count slaves in representation? A state like Virginia and South Carolina is going to have a significant slave population. Will that count and help them have more representatives in the government? And then also another question to think about is what powers will the state have? What powers will the federal government have? Will there be any powers that they share? Under the Articles of Confederation, the states had a lot of power, and it was one of the reasons it didn't work. So they've got to kind of come and find some common ground. Our Constitution is built on a series of compromises. So today we're going to look at some of the key compromises when writing this document. And the first one we're going to think about is representation. So I mentioned earlier on the last slide, how do you determine representation? So here's something to think about. At Etowah, we have student government. Every single grade can elect up to 10 representatives. So the 9th graders can have 10 representatives, the juniors can have 10 representatives. That is equal, okay? That's what the smaller states wanted. What the larger states might want is saying, okay, well, whatever grade, which is usually the 9th grade, has the most people, they send the most representatives. And the smaller grades would send the least. Well, to be honest, as the grades go up, the numbers of the class go down. So that means that you'd have more 9th and 10th graders in student government. That was kind of what was in debate here. How do you determine this? Do you favor your small states that are, and we're not talking about like the physical size, we're talking about the population. The solution is something known as the Great Compromise. And what's going to happen is that they're going to create a bicameral legislature, which is 2 houses. So in the House of Representatives, every state would send representatives based on their population. So today in 2020, for instance, Georgia sends 14 people to the House of Representatives. But a state like California, which is much larger, may send over 50. In the Senate, they decide that they're going to make it fair. Every single state will send 2 senators. It doesn't matter how big or how small. So Texas and California today send 2. Little old Idaho, North Dakota, they send 2. So that's equal. The second issue to look at is slavery. Now, I want to be very clear here. They are not debating whether or not slavery should go away. These founding fathers, even though some of them were against slavery, many of them just make the decision that they're not going to tackle it. The most important thing is national unity, and they push it off for another day. And I think a lot of them thought that slavery would kind of die out naturally. And honestly, slavery ends up being protected within the Constitution. So there's 2 major compromises that happen in regards to slavery. The first one is called the 3/5 Compromise. So a state like Virginia and South Carolina, even Maryland, would have a very large slave population, and they would want it to be counted in the population because it would give them more seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. A state like Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, that's abolished slavery, is not going to want that to happen because they don't think that's fair. And they also don't want to reward slavery. So you have to find some kind of compromise. And ultimately what they do is something known as a 3/5 compromise. For every 5 slaves, you were counting 3. And it had to do with the state's population. So this way it made sure that your southern states didn't end up with this inflated representation in the House. Okay, once again, no discussion here on the morality of slavery, which we know obviously isn't right, but this is what their concerns were. Okay, they didn't want northern states, didn't want slave states to be really powerful in the House because then they could dominate national politics. This will be what we spend a lot of time talking about over the next couple of months. The other major compromise in dealing with slavery had to do with the international slave trade. This is not talking about a slave being sold from North Carolina to Virginia. This is talking about bringing slaves from West Africa to America. And the decision here is that the international slave trade would be banned in 20 years, which would end in 1808, and it will. On this slide, we're going to look at 2 more examples of compromising at the Constitutional Convention. As mentioned earlier, one of the big questions is who should have more power? Should the states have more power or should the federal government? Guys, this is still a huge debate today. People argue about this left and right. So this has not changed from the 1780s to 2020. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the states were really powerful. So at this meeting, they're going to be kind of hesitant to give up a lot of power. So you've got to find that happy medium. And the solution is something known as federalism, which is the division of power between the states and federal government. And there will be things that they each can do. So for instance, a state can determine education, a state can determine marriage laws. The national government is the group that's going to coin money. You know, we don't want every state to have their own currency. They're going to run the national military. So big things like that. But then they have shared powers, things that they both can do. So this is an easy one to remember, especially those of you that are working. They both can tax you. They both have their own court system. Okay, so there's different things that they can each do. They both can write their own laws. We have laws in Georgia that are unique to Georgia that other states don't have, and vice versa. So that's what federalism is, the division of power between states and federal government. The second compromise on this page slide has to do with within the federal government who has the most power. And the Founding Fathers were very, very hesitant to give one person or even the executive branch a lot of power, especially with what they had experienced under King George III. So actually, under the Articles, if you remember, there wasn't even really a strong executive branch. There was a president that served for 1 year. So under the Constitution, they decide that they're going to create 3 different branches. And ultimately what we're looking at here is that each branch would have a list of duties that they are in charge of. So just make sure that we understand our branches are the executive, which the head of is the president, the legislative branch, which is Congress, that's the House of Representatives and Senate, and then the third branch is the judicial branch, and the head of that branch is the Supreme Court. So each of these branches would have their own things that they could do, and then they could have checks over one another. I'm going to show you a slide in a second that will kind of help explain this. But we get this idea from one of the French Enlightened leaders, Montesquieu. So many of the ideas that are in our core government today come from the Enlightenment. John Locke is heavily influences the writing in the Declaration, for instance. So if we take a look at this slide, this is going to help us explain both the separation of powers and the checks and balances. So you'll see that each of the 3 branches has its own shape, different color. If we look under the president, for instance, it tells us that, you know, what groups make up the executive branch and then some of the rules and responsibilities that they have. So for instance, they can enforce the laws. We also know that the president is head of the military. The legislative branch, they make the laws. And then the judicial branch, they interpret the laws. Okay, so for instance, if a state passes a law and says everyone must have purple hair, the courts can strike that down and say, no, that's not a good law, we're going to strike it down. So that's what separation of powers mean. They each have their own list of like duties and responsibilities. But then they can also check one another, and this is where we get this idea of checks and balances. Our hope in creating the Constitution is that these three branches would each have their own sets of duties and responsibilities, and none would grow really powerful and too dominant. And remember, no one wanted a really strong executive branch. So initially, this branch was really weak, and the legislative branch was actually probably more powerful. Today, I think we would argue that the executive branch is very powerful, but not in our early years. So you'll see that there are these arrows that are drawn to each side. And this is an example of the checks and balances. So for instance, if there's an opening on the court, the president can appoint a person to be on the Supreme Court. But then the legislative branch has to approve that judge. Okay, so everyone has their hands on it. If the legislative branch makes a law, the judicial branch can strike it down. On top of that, if Congress makes the law, the president can sign the law or veto it. So they have final say on the law. So that's a check on them as well. If the president violates a law, okay, then Congress can put them on trial for impeachment. You saw this happen last year. So the legislative branch is the only branch that can remove a president from office. So there's all these different ways to make sure that no one is too powerful, okay, and that's what the checks and balances system is.